and welcome to Radical Engagement. We continue our series on the Bordiga and the Lyon thesis. We are currently going through the International Communist Party's introduction to the text from 1970. We are a little over halfway through with this introduction, so we're going to begin now. All right, this is going to give a lot of the ICP's interpretation of the whole mess. As we have seen, and now arrive at the third aspect of the debacle, the running into parallel with the tactical maneuvers, in fact, anticipating them to a certain extent, and in the continued false belief that it was possible to speed up the concentration of the large proletarian forces around the party, a process that had gotten underway of the gradually abandoning the rigorous organizational criteria of the 21 points. Asterisk. Remember that the Borgists thought the 21 points were too lenient and only agreed to it for party discipline. Okay, back in. Have vindicated as necessary the premise for constituting the international on a sound and consistent basis. Asterisk. I think the 21 points were kind of a disaster, but nonetheless. The idea had begun to hold, as opposed by us, that there was still possible room for maneuver, with a view to reorganizing the national particularities within the draconian conditions of admission. It was precisely in the homage to the particularities that the International accepted virtually the entire French ex-socialist party as members, with the only outcome being that one was increasingly obliged to admit, as each new session of the International went by, that one was faced with a badly disguised specter of the same old parliamentarist and even chauvinist social democracy. Earlier, after having caused widespread contamination in the party and aggravating the original elements, the International was practicing at the summit precisely that federalism, i.e. towards the Italian Socialist Party, which the Norwegian and Danish parties were reproached for in 1923. And at the same thing would happen in each country every time arose the vaguest possibility of recruiting numerically greater forces. Eventually, alongside the Communist Party, self-styled sympathizer parties would be welcomed on virtually equal footing into the ranks of the Revolutionary International. Asterisk. This happened with like the KMT. Now we can see here that there is a hard sectarianism in the left faction in Italy's line. There's just no way around that. They don't want to recognize anyone, even if they are under the International, because they're afraid that they'll bring in old bad ideas. This is an interesting way to think. It's not really what's indicated by Marx and Engels' own organizing, but nonetheless. Quote, now that the whole series of tactical innovations was being reeled off and breathing life into the centrifugal currents, which lay dormant within every party, with a string of sudden changes generating confusion and disillusionment amongst even the most hardened militants, the question of discipline was inevitably posed not as a natural and organic product of the prior theoretical homogeneity. Notice this function on theoretical homogeneity. People who think that Bordigism would have been more tolerant of different ideas within its rank, they're not reading what the text said. Bordigists don't purge people, and they tend to be more forgiving of brave standings for certain principles, but their focus on homogeneity and invariance would make them inevitably sectarian. They wouldn't even deny this. I mean, we're talking about a party that claims, yes, we're dogmatists proudly. I can show you the essay if you want to look at it. All right. And a healthy convergence of practical actions, but as a sick reflection of the operational discontinuity and the lack of doctrinal harmony. See this focus on doctrinal harmony. To the same degree that errors, deviations, and capitulations were identified and attempts were made to remedy them by rearranging the Central Committee and Executive, the iron fist was also applied and idealized as the standard method within the Comintern and its sections, and used as a highly effective antidote against the adversaries and false friends. But against fellow comrades, see, this is what's interesting. The iron fist was also applied and idealized as a standard method within the Comintern and its sections, and used as a highly effective antidote against, not against adversaries and false friends, but against fellow comrades. So here, this is where the quest for homogeneity hits a wall with the quest for homogeneity in a different sense. So you have homogeneity of tactics versus homogeneity of theoretical orientation and implied tactics. All right. And in this sense, I'm slightly more sympathetic to the Bordigists than I sound, are the left faction. Let's call them what they are, because the Bordigists really don't come about as a separate thing from the left faction until the 1950s, where Bordiga actually is in a minority position when the party splits. The Internationalist Communist Party splits. The era of the infernal merry-go-round of trials against ourselves. Yeah, this is the purges. And they don't like that. This starts in the 1920s, and these periphery parties, honestly, have begun, to which the left would describe at the Sixth and Large Executive as the sport of humiliation and ideological terrorism, often instigated by humiliated ex-opponents. You don't get trials without gallowers. Discipline towards the program in its original clear and precise form was no longer observed. And it was said that any confusion arising from the lack of discipline could be prevented by recreating genuine Bolshevik parties in vitro. And we all know how these caricatures of Lenin's party turned out under Stalin's heel. At the Fourth Congress, they warned, quote, discipline can only be guaranteed through defining the boundaries in which our methods are applicable, by clearly defining our programs and fundamental tactical resolutions, and through organizational measures. At the Fifth Congress, we repeated that it was pointless pursuing dreams of trouble-free discipline if clarity and accuracy were lacking in the field on which all discipline and organizational homogeneity were dependent. Again, I think this is a contradictory impulse in Bordigism. Like, they want organizational homogeneity, but they want clarity, but they don't see that this would actually be divisive, which is precisely what the Comintern doesn't want. And the Comintern is laying down a heavy hand not to protect the original program. And like I said, I'm not sure which program they're considering invariant, because the program that comes out of Lyon thesis does innovate on the 1918-1919 program. All right. That indulging in dreams of a single world party would be in vain if the continuity and prestige of the international organ was continually destroyed by conceding, not only to the periphery, but to the leaders, the freedom to choose the principles which determine practical action and therefore action itself. And it was hypocritical to invoke the idea of Bolshevization if it didn't signify transient ends and adherence to means to those ends. The problem with Stalinism for the Bordigist is that it's not authoritarian enough. Although they don't like that authoritarianism either. And they do have a big thing about over-punishing comrades. So we got to give them that. All right. Since a military-style discipline was not considered enough, a new organizational recipe was unearthed. The parties would be reconstructed only 5 years after their formation on the basis of the factory cell, considered as a model deriving from the historical patrimony of the Bolshevik. The cell model is a disaster. This is Warren talking. I hate it. I think it's a mess. The factory cell model actually seems to be more based off of the cell model that you see with like terrorist organizations, and not parties, and that's a problem. A form then was supposed to solve the definitionally revolutionary problem of force. We responded to that formula, which was suitable for the pre-1917 Russia, never promoted as an immutable dogma by Lenin that couldn't just be betrothed to the West, and apply it mechanically, which would mean a clear break with the principles which had governed the formation and the real genesis and development of the Revolutionary Party. Yeah, they don't like when what the Bolsheviks did are enforced on the other parties, even though they're complaining about a lack of global homogeneity amongst party centralization. I don't think I'm the only person who can see that this is a contradictory impulse. What it in fact meant was to relapse into laborism, the Sixth and Large Executive, since the Marxist Party isn't definable simply in terms of the social composition of its members, but by the direction it takes. The party is much more vital and aligned precisely insofar that it avoids becoming imprisoned within the narrow and cooperative horizons of the factory gallows. We demonstrate how this revision, vaunted as an antidote to bureaucratization, would, on the contrary, result in a hypertrophy of officialdom, since all that remained was a link to cell and factory to factory was precisely officialdom. And I think that last part is a fair critique, that if this was intended to weaken bureaucracy, the bureaucracy was the only thing that could hold the cells together. So it was going to do the opposite. Now, I think, this is a mote in your eye problem, but nonetheless, I think they're right here. We extended the question to include a much wider and more general problem, which in 1927, 1926, incorporated all the questions desired to consummate the Russian party during its internal struggle. We denounced, before it was too late, the frantic and manic struggle against factionalism. See, this is what I find interesting. Bordigists want homogeneity in the party, but they also think the struggle against factionalism was a mistake. I agree with them that the struggle against factionalism was a mistake, but I don't know how you can get homogeneity in the party if you're also pro-factionalization. Maybe I don't know what they think is the most important vector of homogeneity. We'll have to see, because it's also not class composition. The witch hunt would celebrate in its saturnalias during the ignoble campaign against the Russian left in 1926, 1928. This is the crushing of the left opposition, which really leads up to the Yuzovchina. That's why I'm talking. A witch hunt which had been shunned by the Bolshevik Party in its glorious heyday, even against the open enemy, destroyed if necessary, but not subjugated to cowardly act of self-mudslinging, and which, spread beyond the borders of the Russian state, would produce the first obscene figure of the public persecutor, then the professional informer, and finally the executor. Just as the proletarian revolution is bountiful, so the counter-revolution is cannibalistic, Marx's words. I think it's interesting here what Bordigists or the left faction think is possible for discipline when they reject this measure. I agree with them that this measure was far too far. It leads to, eventually by the 1960s, it leads to wars within the socialist blocs. Not just between communists, between Marxists, Leninist communists even. All right. The first sign of the counter-revolutionary star in ascendance, sign, not cause, which would be Freud's slimy, hypocritical cannibalism of Leninist phraseology, and no one will practice it with more zeal than Johnny-come-lately recruits. The converted Mensheviks, the sackcloth and ashes social patriots, and the inevitable yes-men who gathered in the encroaching gloom. They have been no men, at most maybe men, in the light of which we thought they would never be blotted out again. Yeah, I think this is interesting because the tendency towards all these various weird quasi-chauvinistic or reformist, etc., radicalizations we see today. And in this sense, I'm very sympathetic to what the Bordigists are complaining about. Whatever I see about their contradictions, the contradictions in what they're critiquing are bigger. All right. From here, we would expand on an even more burning issue of salvaging the October Revolution in the crucial year of 1926. We launched the last appeal, despite all prohibitions and threatened sanctions, which were anything but metaphorical, calling on all parties and their world congresses to discuss the crisis in the Russian party. Quote, since the Russian Revolution is the first big step towards world revolution, it is our revolution, its problems are our problems, and its members of the Revolutionary International has not only the right, but the duty to contribute towards resolving it. Sixth Enlarged Congress. Asterisk. I'm going to note that Eric Barnry actually points out that Lenin himself is making some of the concessions that we see cause problem for the Borgists here. The Bordigists seemingly are on the early Lenin timeline. If you want to see this, you would check out Eric Barnry's article, Socialism in One Country, a Reassessment, from 1998. All right. Anyway. We know all too well that there's a crisis in the Communist International, which is at issue. Broaching a subject today, historians have topsy-turvy. It's their job. We would call the greatest of the Russian party lay in the application of strategy and tactics forecast for the fully evolved capitalism in a backwards country, within the framework of a global vision of the October Revolution. In order to build a solid foundation to combat rehashed opportunism, the International should seek solutions to the strategic question, especially how those concerning the relations between victorious dictatorships of the Russian proletariat and the struggling proletariat and the rest of the world, between the state and the party, very importantly, between the state and the Communist International, and also concerning the immense arc of the world revolutionary strategy and associated tactics, resolutions which aren't circumscribed by the Russian experience. We appeal not only for plastering over the cracks, but for a radical change in the modus operandi of the International. There is no such thing as a perfect party. In the case of the Russian party in 1926, the subjective guarantee of non-corruption, the inevitably uncertain and relative, had become irrelevant in any case, since it was not a secondary matter, but a central question of principle, which divided this stupendous organ of theoretical and practical battle, which had once been the party of Red October. If the powerful bulwark of the world's revolution of the passionate post-war years were to be saved from the impending menace of veer to the right, now or never. The meeting of the Sixth Enlarged Executive in February of 1926 marked the end of the Communist International as the International Communist Party. It was the last time the left put an official appearance. See the left's report on the meeting in Communism number 1. There is also Protocol Executive Moscow, February 17th through March 15th, 1926, pages 222 to 144 and 200. Pages 122 to 144 and 283 to 289, page 500, page 577, 609 to 611, and pass them. Yeah. Footnotes are your friend. All right. Anyway, as the left had urged in vain each successive Congress, the communist proletariat communist proletarian movement had to be reconstructed from top to bottom on the basis of the lessons of October and the frank and fearless appraisal of the actions of the Communist International. The Lyon theses and the associated commentary presented to the enlarged executive of February and March of 1926 were meant to bring to this the attention of the endangered revolutionary Russia as a contributor to the form of the international movement. We were gagged and dispersed, but even if our contributions would fall on deaf ears, it is relevant for the future, for the present and future generations. I mean, one would hope. Let's finish this out, and then I will start a different one on the 2000 introduction, and then we'll actually start the actual Lyon theses. It would be non-Marxist to seek sole explanations for a catastrophe that is still sending shock waves today and the deviations of the Comintern from 1922 to 1926. Too many factors have converged, too many objective determinations have ensured that the course of history was and was bound to be precisely as it was. The party's actions were nevertheless an objective element and in given circumstances, a crucial element. Recognizing the origins of opportunism, as we said at the fourth enlarged executive, didn't mean, nor could it mean, accepting opportunism as inevitable, historically necessary fact. Quote, even if the economic situation and future prospects were unfavorable to us, are relatively unfavorable, we shouldn't accept opportunist deviations in spirit of resignation or justify them under the pretext that their causes reside in an objective situation, if, despite everything, an internal crisis does occur. We declare at the fourth enlarged executive, quote, its causes and the means to cure it must be sought elsewhere, that is, in the work and the politics of the party. A curious deduction in the eye of the International, whose categories had eventually ended up as shabby trials where parties, groups, and individuals would be called to account for the tragic setback in Europe and the world, which all came to be explained as a product of unfavorable circumstances and adverse situations. Yeah, material conditions aren't ready, which is a way of saying we're not going to explain why we fucked up. Anyway, the Broder gets to write about that too. In fact, it was the trials which were needed, but radical critical revisions based on the impersonal fact which aimed to uncover the infinitely complex play of cause and effect between the objective and subjective factors, which showed that although the influence of the party on those objective facts, considered for the moment themselves independently of our collective action, was limited, it was in our power to safeguard, even at the price of unpopularity and a lack of immediate success, the sole conditions for which the subjective factors would be enabled to influence history and stimulate it to bear fruit, aka subjective factors, aka maintaining a remnant program. That's what they mean. So they become a remnant of, the 1917, 1919 Bolsheviks as a manifestation of their understanding in Italy. The party would be nothing if it weren't objectively and subjectively, both for its militants and undifferentiated working class, the uninterrupted conducting thread which remains intact through the flux and influx of varying circumstances, or even if broken, which remains unaltered. the struggle to keep the thread from breaking, the struggle to keep it during the long years of victorious Stalinism, the struggle to preserve it and reconnect it to the war party of the proletariat around that, therefore remains our battle. Around 1970, a bunch of various council and Bordiga's communist movements of the left faction had a bunch of conferences, which probably prompted the ICP to publish this. I don't know, but I have this book. You have to forgive me for going getting it. On the conferences of the communist left from 1977 and 1980, when after the failure of May 68, a lot of the French and Italian dissident organizations called for discussions. Now, I'm not sure that the ICP was there. Yes, it was. So the groups that participated were the IC International, the the Communist Workers Organization, the International Communist Current, and then some other things such as the Communist Nuclearist International and the I don't know what that translates to. Fomento Obrero Revolucionario and Il Leninista, the Leninist. So the ICC, which is a kind of concessionary council communist group. When I say concessionary, they're concessionary to the Bordigist, or at least the Dementist, the left faction of the Italians. But anyway, that is happening in the 70s, and it does seem tied to the failure of the Situationists and other critics, and the Maoist Spandex and a bunch of critics of the European parties who didn't become straight up Maoist to respond to the situation. And the Internationalist Communist Party seems to be partly tied into that. I don't know that for sure. That's just my guess, given what I know about the timeline. Anyway, there's a lot of sectariana here. We're going to finish the introduction in episode 8 of this series, and then we will start discussions of the actual text. All right. Like and subscribe, hit the bell if you want to become a patron and get much more stuff, including me discussing anthropology, Soviet history, etc. You can sign up. We try to make the vast majority of this freely available on YouTube, and also the main interview is available on a free podcast feed. So if you just want to help this grow and you don't have money, and we don't necessarily, well, it'll take your money, don't get me wrong. I don't necessarily think that everyone needs to pay to get access to this stuff. You enable me to continue to do this if you give, and you will get more education for it. But if you don't, just share, like and subscribe, leave reviews, comments, etc., and help this get spread. This is an unmonetized channel, and it's going to remain so. Partly because I'm even gotten copy strikes lately that were completely BS, but nonetheless. So like and subscribe, hit the bell, find the Patreon, find the free podcast feed if you don't want to watch this on TV and you don't want to see my poorly bearded mug and my scraggly hair. Have a great day.